KRMS. Good morning, everyone. I'm Manny Haley, and we are set up now, getting ready here for page number 2, and that will be our weekly check-in with David Stokes from the Show Me Institute, talking about this past legislative session. We call this segment Show Me at the Lake. David is actually transporting. He's in transit, as we say today, actually making his way, I think, into Warren County. He emailed me last night and said, so he'll be calling in here in just a little bit. We'll go over some different things from the legislative session. Really interested to hear his perspective. I've heard some different comments come out of this last legislative session, not just from the Speaker of the House and the Speaker Pro Tem and the Senate and the House of Representatives here in the state of Missouri, but also from the governor, lieutenant governor. A lot of different people have weighed in, and we'll get David's perspective on that. That is this morning's page 2 of the Morning Magazine here on News Talk KRMS. 573-302-7000, 877-330-1150. The email address, that is live at krmsradio.com. And just like that, the phone line lights up, and that would be David Stokes with the Show Me Institute. Good morning, David. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Manny. Great to be with you and your listeners.
How's the road treating you this morning?
The road is just fine. Highway 70 is crowded, but not too crowded as I drive out to Warren County, a little bit outside of St. Louis, to testify in opposition to an enhanced enterprise zone that they're considering doing there, much like the one being considered in Camden County.
Boy, you're just, they just want you to talk about these things all over the state, huh?
It's true. When we decide to really focus on an individual project, it's almost always, I would say always, because local citizens, local activists have contacted us and asked us for assistance, which we are happy to get involved and happy to provide them with sort of the information they need to fight back at their own local government.
Well, and that's really one of the reasons why we decided to have you on this program on a regular basis, a weekly basis here, is to get into different issues that either folks have contacted you about or folks have talked with us about, and then get your perspective on it and weigh the pros and cons of it. And this week is no different, although we're not, it's not necessarily a lake issue per se this week, but it's the entire legislative session that just wrapped up about a week ago in Jefferson City. A lot of different comments have been made, positive, negative, in the middle. Was this a good legislative session in your opinion?
You know, Manny, I think it had a very strong ending. I will commend the leadership of the House and Senate, because after a session that had a lot of infighting and some confusion, I think they had a very strong last couple days and passed some very good legislation at the end. Most importantly, tax cut for Missouri citizens and businesses, and we will see if Governor Nixon is going to sign that or veto that.
That's one of the big hanging questions, and we'll get into that here throughout the course of the interview, is going to be what the governor will do or won't do with all of these bills that were sent to his desk. You mentioned the infighting that really started at the beginning of the session and then kind of lagged through the middle. It seemed like, though, towards the end, some of the bickering had subsided a little, or at least it wasn't quite as contentious as it was at the start.
Well, I think at the end, the Republican Party, with their strong majorities in both bodies, realized, hey, we've had the internal discussions, we've had the fighting. It's time to make our decisions, agree, and just vote as a block on some key issues. And they were able to do that on tax cuts, and they were not able to do that on some other key issues, such as tax credit reform. But and I would also say on coming to a final decision on transportation funding, another huge issue, which did not get moved forward in this session. And I would say probably for the better, because as much as I think we should invest in our infrastructure, like on I-70, which I'm driving on right now, I don't think that a general sales tax was the right way to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting that kind of fell apart. It seemed like in the beginning when that idea was first introduced, I believe Mike Kehoe had something to do with that at some point in time from right up the road here in Jefferson City about getting that bill introduced, and it seemed like it was gaining momentum. And then you didn't hear anything, and then towards the end there was a bit of a push, but not enough to make that happen. Do you, and again, do you see that as an issue that's probably going to come up again next year?
Absolutely, and I hope it does. I'd like to see us invest in our transportation infrastructure in this state. I would just like to see it done primarily through a gas tax increase as opposed to a sales tax increase. And there's some other fees that you can bring into this. But paying for highways is something you can do through gas taxes and toll roads. I think toll roads need to be a part of the conversation. And we need to put these questions to the voters. Say, look, if you drive a lot, you use these roads, and you're going to pay for it with higher gas taxes. But I think we can trust the Missouri voters to make a good decision on this. And I think there's a good chance they would pass a gas tax increase. But one of the reasons they were focused on a sales tax increase was that it simply polled better. And while that might have made it easier to pass if it could have gotten through the legislature, I don't think we should do poor policy decisions just because they happen to poll a little better than the right decision, which would be a gas tax and tolling.
I do know that there were a lot of people concerned with the entire issue of a transportation tax. Now, granted, it was going to have to be voted on by the people before it would go into effect, but it would be something that would not hit the ballot probably until 2014, and there was some concern that it may change before that time or the sentiment of the people would change. But the roads in Missouri need a lot of work, and at some point there is the money's not going to be coming from Jefferson or from Washington, D.C. to Jefferson City anytime soon.
No, I really hope in the next session, I hope we're talking about a transportation investment plan in the state that's funded primarily by a gas tax increase. And if there's some, I don't even think a small one, but some moderate level of a gas tax increase, perhaps in the range of 10 to 15 cents, I think I would be out there enthusiastically backing that. You know, devils are always in the details, but in general terms, I think this state would benefit from such an increase.
We're talking with David Stokes here from the Show Me Institute on this morning's edition of Show Me at the Lake on the Morning Magazine on News Talk 1150, 97.5 KRMS. Besides transportation not going through, were there any other major issues that the General Assembly did not, let's put it this way, didn't get to the finish line this time around?
Well, tax credit reform was a big one. It came very close, and they, in the end, had a compromise bill that the Senate and House the Senate had passed really good tax credit reform earlier in the session. It went to the House where it languished for a while, and they didn't make the bill quite as good, but in the end they passed something that was pretty good. It put some caps on our very generous tax credit program for historic building rehab, which is mostly spent in our cities, and some other tax credits. Missouri makes far more use of tax credits than most other states. We are really very generous at it. And all this bill did was reform it and cap it to some level, but it also added a few new small tax credits. And when it went back to the Senate on the last day, there were some senators who are really opposed to this tax credit abuse, and they were just strongly opposed to adding anything new, and they didn't think the reforms went far enough, so it got shut down. It wasn't a great bill, but it was probably a good first step to some needed tax credit reforms, and I wish it would have been passed. That said, I understand the concerns of the senators who blocked it at the end.
This has been, for those that aren't familiar with this, tax credit reform has been a hot-button issue for the General Assembly for 4 years now, maybe 5 years, and maybe even further back than that.
Absolutely. We have a very generous historic building tax credit program, which is made extensive use of in St. Louis and Kansas City, around the state too, but mostly in our cities. We have a very generous low-income housing tax credit program, which subsidizes low-income housing around the state. And there's just been attempts to cap and limit these type of programs. A tax credit is nothing more than taking tax dollars from regular taxpayers and giving them to somebody else to subsidize an activity. And nobody's talking about eliminating these programs at all, just sort of reducing their growth and lowering the cap to a more reasonable level. Yet it still just can't get through. Our legislature and our government under both parties has made heavy use of tax credits to try and grow our economy over the past 2 decades, and it really has not succeeded, in my opinion.
One of the bills that did make it through that is on the governor's desk is in regard to gun control legislation, and whether or not the governor will sign that, we haven't heard. Have you been privy to any information saying one way or another or which direction maybe the governor will go on this particular piece, which basically says the state of Missouri would not enforce any type of federal gun control legislation?
I do not have any inside information. My personal feeling is that the governor will probably veto that. That type of nullification legislation is very tricky and very dangerous. I am not a supporter, personally speaking. This isn't really a topic Show Me Institute covers.
Right.
I don't support gun control, and I do support a level of discretion at the local level as local sheriffs, they know their county best, and local sheriffs should have some degree of discretion as to how to make their counties safe for the citizens of that county. That said, these type of preempting laws are a very dangerous path, and probably wouldn't, whether he signed it or not, it would probably not hold up in court.
One other piece of legislation that is still, I guess, faces a bit of an unknown certainty is dealing with the Department of Revenue. The governor was adamant that the bill that moved through, talking about cutting funding for the DOR, he's probably going to veto. Is this really setting things up for a pretty contentious veto session in September?
Well, I think there's a good chance we'll have a very interesting veto session. It's unlikely that we're going to have any type of a special session, but with a number of bills being passed in the final day there, the governor will likely veto a few major pieces of Republican legislation, and I think we will have an interesting veto session. This Department of Revenue issue is tied in closely with the I think legitimate scandal and legitimate concerns a lot of people have about giving that data to the federal government improperly. And so I think there's a lot of politics in this fight about cutting the funding in response to this scandal. So whether or not it happens, I think the end result of it might be less about public policy and more about politics and of the issue. That said, I do support efforts to get to the bottom of what happened with this concealed carry data gift, and I don't think it was appropriate what they did.
It seems like there's going to have to be some more investigation, and from everything that we continue to hear is that there is more that will probably happen this summer. Of course, the governor came out a few weeks ago and said, well, if you're going to pass this bill that's going to cut the funding, then we're going to have to start cutting jobs on July 1st at the DOR. Still no word exactly how many people will lose their jobs, but of course that would happen before the veto session. But between that and maybe some more information will be available before then, before that veto session would start, that definitely would have an impact then on what would happen with that particular bill.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see. My personal feeling is that cuts to the DOR, we'd like sequestration at the national level. We might have a great deal of fear about it, but in the end, we wouldn't notice the cuts too much in our day-to-day lives. And I think if you just, most of the people are not fans of the DOR and the DMV, but we also fear longer waits when we go to renew our plates and that. So I think the effect of a salary cut or an employee cut would not be so dramatic. That said, it remains to be seen. And if people suddenly start waiting in line 20 minutes longer, they're not going to like it.
One other issue that I know has been debated every single legislative session for years now, and that is education reform in the state of Missouri. Is that ever really going to make both sides happy in Jefferson City if there is any type of comprehensive education reform that comes forward?
You know what? There's just a strange alliance of people opposed to it, consisting of a lot of liberal Democrats from the cities and suburbs and conservative Republicans from the rural areas who just have teamed up for a couple of years now running to kill any major reform efforts for school choice or vouchers or things such as that. We've got an analyst at Show Me Institute named James Schultz, who I think has been on your show,
yep,
who covers this area very closely and does a great job with it. But yes, once again, efforts to institute even very small voucher programs or small school choice efforts, or the effort to require grading of teachers and reform some teacher tenure rules, it failed once again at the legislature. And I think in the next few years, it's going to be hard to pass till we get some till people in the rural areas start to realize just how bad the situation is in schools in the cities.
Well, and that's always been the battle, I think, with this entire idea of education reform. If you take the teachers out of the conversation for a second, it does seem like it sets up a battle between the rural areas and the cities in the state of Missouri.
Right, and the problem is, from a political perspective, you have a lot of rural legislators who don't have many private schools in their districts, or only have one, perhaps small one. So it doesn't really affect them. So and the school districts are so often a major employer within a district, within a Senate district or a state rep district, and the teachers there are very powerful and both very popular among their communities. So it's hard until you get some people who really see how bad the situation is in some of the cities in the inner suburbs, and also realize that not all of Missouri's rural school districts are as good as people think they are. We need education reform in this state, and hopefully in the next few years we'll get a circle of legislators together who can pass some meaningful legislation. And I would encourage your listeners to check out what James Scholes has written at showmeinstitute.org, because he knows this issue much better than I and really has a great number of studies and arguments on why education reform would benefit this state.
If you have to grade this session using the grades that we all grew up with in school, A, B, C, D, F, what grade would you give the Legislative Assembly for 2013?
I'd give it a B, maybe a B+. I think the tax reform legislation that if the governor signs it, and if not, hopefully they can override the veto. I mean, it's about time that we lowered our personal and business tax rates in the state. Kansas just last year passed a dramatic tax cut. It was an enormous tax cut for businesses, and also a residential tax cut as well. And I think, businesses in the Kansas City area, too many Missouri businesses are going to really look at moving across State Line Road to Kansas. It's very simple to do. And I think we need to respond to that. And I think this tax cut is necessary for Missouri's economic well-being in the future. So with that act alone, plus some positive licensing laws that were passed, sort of reducing occupational licensing rules for a few professions, I think they did some good things. They had a very strong ending.
David Stokes with the Show Me Institute. Thank you so much for the time, sir. Again, give us your information and then also that website for the Show Me Institute if people would like to, again, check out what the Show Me Institute is all about.
Manny, you can find studies and op-eds on a number of the topics we just talked about at showmeinstitute.org, and your listeners can always follow me on Twitter at David C. Stokes.
Thanks so much for the visit, sir. Safe travel to you, and have a great Memorial Day weekend. We'll talk with you next Thursday.
I hope you and all your listeners have a great Memorial Day down in the Ozarks. I know it's going to be busy and a lot of fun, and talk to you next week.
Sounds good. David Stokes with the Show Me Institute.